Lesson 10, The Purges and Great Terror 2. Let's review Lesson 9. Stalin built upon a legacy of violence that was a part of Russian history. We looked at the Tsars, we talked about Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and others, and what Stalin was doing in the 1930s was not unprecedented, at least when it comes to the methods that were used. Lenin used violence on a huge scale compared to the Tsars, so that was another precedent that Stalin built upon. Stalin would use violence on an even bigger scale than Lenin, and that really was the difference between Stalin and Lenin and Stalin and the Tsars before him, where Stalin killed millions and millions and enslaved millions and millions. Lenin killed in the hundreds of thousands, and the Tsars killed in the tens of thousands if we're considering individual Tsars and their individual reigns. By 1934, Stalin was really in control of the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union. And indeed, he was essentially in control of the Soviet Union by 1928-29. And yet we see this, or we will see today, this explosion in violence and terror. The Ryutin affair of 1932 led to a traditional purge of the party. Some party members lost their membership cards. However, Stalin was testing the waters to see what he could do to fellow old Bolsheviks. This is what we call a trial balloon. I mentioned this last lesson. This was a way for Stalin to see what he could get away with ultimately. He wanted Ryutin murdered. The other Bolsheviks in the Politburo refused to do that. Ryutin was sentenced to hard labor. Why Stalin decided to murder many of the old Bolsheviks, even though he was in an unassailable position, is open to debate. And much of that comes down to the man's own psychology. The organ of terror would be the NKVD, the successor to the Cheka. So today when we talk about the individual crimes in the millions, it is mainly the NKVD that is carrying this out. Launching the Purges, the murder of Kirov. That's Kirov there on the right-hand side. Sergei Kirov was in charge of Leningrad, and he was a loyal follower of Stalin. So here's a fellow Bolshevik. He was of the younger generation that Stalin had raised up. We might call him one of Stalin's cronies or one of Stalin's magnates. They were very, very good friends. They would go on holiday together. So this is not as if he was a rival of Stalin. At best, we might even say he was a protege in some ways. However, he was one of the Politburo members who went against Stalin's wishes to have Ryutin executed for criticizing collectivization. So when the Ryutin affair developed, he did not want Ryutin murdered. So that puts a mark on his back when it comes to Stalin, or what Stalin thinks of him. Moreover, at the 17th Party Congress in 1934, Kirov was elected to the Central Committee of the party with more votes than Stalin and was riding a tide of increasing popularity. So what this means, it's not as if that Kirov beat Stalin in some type of election per se. It just means when the Bolshevik Party was having its once a year, it wasn't always once a year, but we'll say once a year just to keep it simple. When the voting for the Central Committee was going on, it just so happened when they're choosing the people, Kirov got more votes than Stalin. Kirov came in first, Stalin came in second. They both go to the Central Committee, but it just shows that amongst the party conference members, Kirov seemed to be more popular. That puts another mark on his back. And on the 1st of December 1934, Leonid Nikolaev, a fellow communist, murdered Kirov inside his Leningrad office. Now, what's quite interesting all about this murder is that on a previous occasion, Nikolaev had been caught approaching Kirov with a revolver, but had been released by the GPU, which was an offshoot of the NKVD. It is possible, if not probable, that Stalin ordered Kirov's assassination. Otherwise, why would this man have been released? That's certainly what most historians believe now. Nikolaev himself was arrested and executed a few weeks after the murder, along with 15 others. One of the first rules of assassination is that you kill the assassins. If you're the one planning the assassination, you get rid of the people who do the killing because they can speak. They can talk and say who actually gave the orders. So it's perhaps no surprise that Nikolaev was himself murdered or executed, I dare say, very shortly after this. So what happens in the aftermath of Kirov's murder? Well, if he was guilty or not, Stalin used the murder to his advantage. He whipped up hysteria that there was a Trotskyite leftist conspiracy to destroy the party from within. Now remember, Trotsky is not in the country anymore. He's abroad. But this is what Stalin is saying about this murder. It's Trotsky working abroad with other Bolsheviks within the Soviet Union to destroy the party. And within 2 hours of hearing of Kirov's murder, Stalin brought in the Decree Against Terrorist Acts, or the December 1st Decree. And ultimately what Stalin did is he used the murder as an excuse to go after anyone he suspected of opposing him. So put another way, it's Kirov's murder that launches the Purges and ultimately the Great Terror. And unlike the Purge that we talked about last lesson after Ryutin's arrest and imprisonment, where people just lost their party cards and their memberships, this purge was violent and bloody and would be the new modus operandi for all future purges. Modus operandi simply means the mode of operating or the way things work. And the way things would work in the future was murder, murder, murder. And as I said before, these purges, there would be a pause, there would be a slowdown in the arrests and the imprisonments and the killings, but they never truly go away. And they would continue until Stalin's death in 1953. So what was in this decree, the Decree Against Terrorist Acts? Well, this is a primary source. This is what the law said. The Central Executive Committee of the USSR decrees that the following amendments on the investigation and consideration of cases relating to terrorist organizations and terrorist acts against agents of the Soviet government shall be introduced into the existing criminal codes of the Union republics. 1. The investigation of such cases must be terminated during a period of not more than 10 days. 2. The indictments must be presented to the accused 24 hours before the hearing of the case in court. 3. The cases must be heard without participation of a defense counsel. That's a key one there. You're not allowed a lawyer if you are accused and arrested. 4. Appeal against the sentences and also petitions of pardons are not to be admitted. So there's no appeal. There's no pardons. If you're guilty and you're sentenced to death, that's it. Or if you're sentenced to the gulags, that's it. And 5, sentence to the higher degree of punishment must be carried out immediately after the passing of the sentence. An interesting question is, how did Stalin get his decrees through the Politburo and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union? Let's remember, Stalin already had great influence in the party, of course. Before the purges, via the Lenin enrollment, which we talked about during the power struggle, and his position within the party, whereby he could appoint various lackeys into high positions of power. So he had already been doing that before 1924, and of course that would continue. However, in the early 1930s, Stalin had had many new members join the party who were skilled workers and careerists. They joined not out of devotion to socialism, but for self-serving reasons. So by 1934, this process which he had been doing to help him win the power struggle, he continued with that process, and he just kept loading up the party with people who were loyal to him. Once accepted into the party, they knew they owed their positions of privilege to Stalin and were therefore more than willing to agree to anything he said. We'll talk more about this group when we look at social policy. They have a collective name called the Nomenklatura. So it's worth mentioning some of Stalin's key cronies during this period. Yagoda, Yezhov, and Beria are all, at one time or another, chiefs of the NKVD. Yagoda will be purged. Yezhov will be purged. Beria will survive. Nikita Khrushchev, who will succeed Stalin, that's to say he will take over from Stalin when Stalin dies in 1953. He was the Moscow party boss. He was involved in the purges to a great extent. Molotov, who was chairman of the People's Commissars, again, another close friend of Stalin, he was involved a great deal, and so was Lazar Kaganovich, who was a member of the Politburo. Eliminating old rivals. Unsurprisingly, some of Stalin's first targets were his old rivals for power, Kamenev and Zinoviev. We'll remember that those two men were allowed back into the party. They were not given any high positions, but they did grovel their way back in by saying Stalin was right and they were wrong, and Stalin went after them. 17 Bolsheviks, including Zinoviev and Kamenev, were accused of helping kill Kirov. They were tried secretly at this stage in the sense that the trials were only known to high-ranking Bolsheviks. So these trials did not become known to average Bolshevik citizens. Some of the 17 were executed. However, at this stage, investigators could not create enough evidence to link Zinoviev and Kamenev to the murder, so they were given hard labor in the gulags for being morally responsible for Kirov's death. And at this stage, the NKVD, I think we could say, was finding its feet, so to speak, when it came to creating evidence, because creating is the key word here. There is not any evidence because these men, though they are criminals in many other ways, we might say, for a lot of the crimes that they committed against the enemies of the Bolsheviks, they certainly were not guilty for this murder. So the NKVD had to invent evidence. And at this stage, they're not that good at it, perhaps. The major way they do it going forward is by torturing people into confessions, but not just personal confessions, also confessing that other people were involved as well. In any event, the message was clear. No one, including at least former top Bolsheviks, was safe from Stalin. The Great Purge, 1936 to 39. One might think that after this bloodletting, Stalin would relent. However, after these first trials and executions, Stalin increased the tempo of terror and murder. So this first trial, Kamenev and Zinoviev are thrown into the gulags. You would think that might be the end. No, this is only the beginning. Claiming that the Soviet Union was under siege from within, that's to say, there was conspiracy to destroy the Soviet Union, the purges were greatly intensified to the point that no Soviet citizen was safe. The scale of the purges was so vast during this period that it is also known as the Great Terror. Depending on the books, sometimes it's called the Great Purge, sometimes the Great Terror, sometimes just the Terror. So the Great Purge in hindsight had 3 stages. So first, the purge of the Bolshevik Party itself. Second, the purge of the military. And 3, the purge of wider Soviet society. We sometimes just say the purge of the people. So let's look at the purge of the party. This began with a secret letter originating from Stalin, warning the party of a Trotskyite, Kamenevite, Zinovievite, leftist counter-revolutionary bloc. So the Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, their supporters are out to destroy the party. The letter encouraged party members to root out all wreckers and for all Soviet citizens to denounce plotters. In the backdrop of this, Zinoviev and Kamenev were put on trial again, this time publicly for killing Kirov and plotting to kill Stalin. These were the first of the so-called show trials. These were essentially kangaroo courts where the guilt of the accused was a given before the trial took place. So Zinoviev and Kamenev were dead men before the trial had even begun. Zinoviev and Kamenev initially refused to accept guilt. However, their families were threatened and they underwent intense interrogations, that's to say torture, in order to confess to their crimes. What finally tipped them over to confess was a personal promise from the Politburo, represented by Stalin, to spare their lives. They were found guilty of terrorism and being members of the Trotskyite Zinoviev Center. And both were executed in August 1936. Stalin broke his word. He took great glee in getting these two men to confess. He took great glee in getting them to believe that he was going to spare them, and apparently he thought it was just hilarious that in the end he got to dupe them and have them murdered. Well, there's Zinoviev after having been tortured. There are no physical marks on him, but he was kept awake for great periods, which in itself is a form of torture, and you can see that the man is broken. Certainly he looks exhausted. Here's an interesting quote from Montefiore from his excellent book Stalin, Court of the Red Tsar. "The bullets with their noses crushed were dug out of the skulls, wiped clean of blood and pearly brain matter, and handed to Yagoda, probably still warm. Yagoda labeled the bullets Zinoviev and Kamenev and treasured these macabre but sacred relics, taking them home to be kept proudly with his collection of erotica and ladies' stockings. The bodies were cremated." So Yagoda, who was the head of the NKVD at this point, had those bullets taken out of the brains of Zinoviev and Kamenev so he could keep them. What a charming man. Bukharin and the bloc of rightists and Trotskyites. Unsurprisingly, Bukharin and other top Bolsheviks were denounced, arrested, and put on trial. They were accused of being rightists in league with Trotsky. Now, you might recall earlier Trotsky was a part of a leftist conspiracy or a center conspiracy. That just changed with whatever was needed at the time. Trotsky could be on the left, Trotsky could be in the center or on the right. It really didn't matter. Remember, Trotsky has nothing to do with this. This is all just invented by Stalin. Bukharin, along with 20 others, including Rykov and Yagoda, because Yagoda, remember, he was the head of the NKVD as well, he was removed, and they were put on trial in March 1938. Why would Yagoda be removed? Well, because he was building up his own power base in the NKVD. He was in charge of the torturers, the murderers, etc., and Stalin saw him as a potential threat as well. So why not just have him removed and replace him with somebody else? In this case, it was with Yezhov. So these were more show trials. All the defendants admitted their guilt for, again, the same reasons, that they were promised to be kept alive, they were promised to be spared, they were tortured, their families were threatened, whatever. Historians speculate that some were tortured or cut deals to protect their loved ones. Well, that's almost exactly what did happen. 17 of the 20 defendants, including Bukharin, were shot. An interesting thing going on in this period are the amount of denunciations. That's to say, people grassing each other or people ratting each other out, whatever you want to say. And it's an interesting period because it's almost a every man for himself mentality. I better rat this person out before he rats me out. So it's worth looking at these a little bit more closely, these denunciations. And again, essentially this meant ratting out other party members and accusing them of having gone against the party, or that's to say, going against Stalin in some way in the past. Family members were encouraged to denounce each other. Wives were told to divorce husbands if the husbands were denounced, and vice versa, by the way. Being denounced usually resulted in arrest, torture, and imprisonment, or arrest, torture, and death. And also, this is what makes it a kind of sad commentary on human nature, at least for some humans anyway, that the denunciations were carried out for many mundane reasons: settling old scores, removing romantic rivals, envy, career advancement, etc. So if you think in this period where any denunciation almost automatically meant arrest, torture, and at least being sent to the gulags. Well, what if you're somebody who fancies somebody else's wife or girlfriend, or you want somebody's job? All you need to do is perhaps call. You might not want to go there personally, but just call the local police station and say, Ivan at such and such factory, who's a manager, is a wrecker, and he is a member of the Trotskyite bloc, and he's trying to wreck the factory that he manages because he's in league with Trotsky. That would be enough to get rid of him, and perhaps you're the number 2 man in that factory. You get promoted. Maybe you don't like somebody on just a personal level. Maybe you're afraid of somebody's going to grass you for whatever reason, so you grass him first. Let's say just lie, really. Or maybe you just like somebody's wife and you want to start dating her, you want to woo her, get rid of the husband by just saying the husband is a wrecker. That's all you need to do. So the next stage was the purge of the military, 1937 to 39. Field Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky's arrest and execution in 1937 sparked the elimination of the military leadership. Half of the Red Army's 35,000 officers were imprisoned or shot. The vast majority had the rank of major or above. So we're talking about senior officers here. 91 of 101 members of the Supreme Military Council were arrested. 88 of them were shot. So essentially a death rate of 80%. All serving admirals of the Soviet Navy were shot. And only one senior commander of the Soviet Air Force survived the purge. Now the big question is, why? Why purge the military when, after all, the 1930s are becoming increasingly dangerous to the Soviet Union from outside, and we'll talk about that in a future lesson. Hitler has taken over Germany by this period. He's made no bones, Adolf Hitler. He's made no bones about hating Jewish Bolshevism and hating the Soviet Union and wishing to conquer Slavic lands and colonize those lands with Germans. So why get rid of your military? Well, if you think about it, the military is, again, perhaps the only group, even though they're loaded with people who are loyal to Stalin, but the only group that potentially could go after him. So if you look at this, simply the military was the only state organ that could potentially challenge Stalin. And the reason for that is that militaries are hierarchical. That's to say, it's a pyramid. You've got marshals at the top, or field marshals, and generals, then colonels, then majors, and all the way down to privates. And the only way any military can function is by blind obedience. Even today in so-called democracies or freer societies before our period, militaries are hierarchical. And if an order is given from the top, it will be followed at the bottom, or you can almost guarantee 100% it will be followed. So all you need are a couple of these generals who are in charge of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of military men. You just need a few of them to start working together to protect themselves to go after Stalin. So Stalin has them destroyed. So, as I say here, if a group of generals decide to challenge Stalin, they could expect those under them to follow their orders. And of course, none of these generals and field marshals were thinking of doing this during the 1930s. As I said, they were already Stalin's loyal toadies or cronies, whichever you prefer. But Stalin was not prepared to take any chances. Some of these military men had been around since the Civil War, so these were not necessarily people that Stalin had put in place himself. As far as they went, they were not looking to remove Stalin, but Stalin, as I said, was not prepared to take any chances. Those executed or sent to the gulags were replaced with loyal, reliable sycophants. So essentially yes men who would definitely do whatever Stalin wanted. And in many cases, these were not talented military men, and ultimately the purge of the military weakened the Soviet military enormously. And the final stage was the purge of the people, 1937 to 1939. This part of the purges is sometimes known as the Yezovchina, the time of Yezhov, who at this point was the leader of the NKVD. He took over from Yagoda in 1936. Yagoda was arrested, and as we know, he was executed as well. It's also known as the period of the Great Terror, when the people are the main target. Just normal people, not even necessarily Bolshevik Party members who just happen to be normal people. We're talking anybody within Soviet society. Yagoda himself was denounced and executed. I've already mentioned that. This was when the accusations, show trials, murders worked their way down into the lower levels of Soviet society all across the country. From the Pacific Ocean all the way to Leningrad, this was going on. Soviet citizens denounced each other. As I said before, party members were doing something similar, and Soviet citizens were doing the same thing. As a perhaps self-preservation, I need to denounce my neighbor before he denounces me, or once again for just mundane reasons, envy, jealousy, coveting what one's neighbor has, maybe wanting to get somebody's job, who knows what, but people were doing this on a grand scale. But actually, putting aside the denunciations, most people were simply arrested and killed for no reason. This made the Soviet state and Stalin even more terrifying. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but there were essentially quotas that the NKVD were given for particular areas, and they needed to meet those quotas. What kind of quotas? Quotas for arrests. So why did this happen? Well, I just suggested one reason. Let's look at this in more detail. 1. Stalin allowed his cronies to search for enemies anywhere and everywhere. The purges, in a sense, became organic. So the people below Stalin, just your average NKVD officers, were allowed to just find enemies anywhere. So they were just doing what they wanted to do and just rounding people up willy-nilly. 2. They became, that's to say, the purges became tied to the second and third 5-year plans. Managers who did not meet their industrial quotas were deemed saboteurs and were sent to the gulags or executed. So remember that the 5-year plans, there were certain quotas of production that had to be met. If a manager was not meeting that quota, that meant he's a saboteur and off he goes to the gulag, or he gets a bullet in the neck for being a wrecker or being a Trotskyite or what have you. 3. This became a good time to direct the purges at non-Russians as well. Poles, Germans, what have you, to cow them and completely subordinate them to the Soviet state. We must remember that the Soviet Union, just like Russia today and Russia in the past, is a multi-ethnic place. It is not just for Russians. Stalin thought this was a good time to go after non-Russians. We'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about cultural life in the Soviet Union. Stalin becomes a big booster of all things Russian to try to pull the country together, and so non-Russians become a target as well. 4. The purge of the people was tied to the gulag system. Because the death rate was so high in the gulags due to their poor conditions, let's say a lack of food, lack of warm clothing, lack of heating, etc., a never-ending supply of zeks was needed to keep the gulags going. Zeks is just a word for inmate. So these systems needed more and more humans to make them work. Because remember, these people in the gulags are not just sitting around, they are carrying out slave labor in this system. So you need more and more inmates. Number 5, the quota system also meant that anyone was liable to be taken for execution or the gulag. The quotas were the brainchild of Yezhov and Stalin. So as I said, this is probably one of the most macabre elements of the purges, or perhaps most horrifying, is the fact that each area within the Soviet Union, right down to individual neighborhoods and cities, the NKVD was given quotas. So within an area of, let's say, 10,000 people in some part of Moscow, the NKVD would be given a quota of the number of arrests in that area of 10,000 people for a particular period. And just like many other aspects during this period of the 1930s, they were expected to exceed their quotas. So it wasn't just enough to meet your quota. If you wanted to keep Stalin happy, you needed to go beyond your quota. So you could see how individual secret policemen would just round up anybody. And indeed they did. In some cases, they would drive around in vans and just grab people off the street to meet their quotas. That's how bad it was. Number 6, regional Communist Party bosses wanted to show their zeal, that's to say their enthusiasm, and loyalty to Stalin, so they exceeded their quotas, as I said a moment ago, and demanded more murders and imprisonments to remove wreckers and traitors. So again, it's kind of this idea of the organic nature of this, that as these orders filtered their way down, the people who are at the ground level, so to speak, or at the local level, they want to prove to Stalin how good they are. And so they go for even more murders, more imprisonments, etc., to show their loyalty. And finally, arbitrary arrests, murders, and imprisonments kept the Soviet people in a constant state of terror. And that's what Stalin wanted. He wanted the people to be afraid of him. And what better way to be afraid than to never know if you're going to get a knock at the door and that you're going to be rounded up and sent to the gulags. What's the butcher bill, so to speak, or how many victims are we talking about here when we think about the purge of the people? Well, the number of ordinary people who were killed is hard to measure, just like the Holocaust, because the written evidence is far from complete. If you look at Holocaust numbers, I know the number of 6 million is always thrown around, but if you actually drill into that, historians will argue it's somewhere between 4.5 to 6 million. No one's ever going to be 100% sure. Just like this, there's no perfect number because there's no statistics, so to speak. There are some records that tell us, well, 10,000 people were killed here and mass graves were found, etc. We know that Stalin signed individual death warrants in the thousands, but how many were actually killed is a bit of an educated guess. So historians agree that something like 1.2, perhaps 1.3 million Soviet citizens were murdered and millions more were sent to the gulags, where they were worked to death, of course. In one quota program aimed at the kulaks, nearly 700,000 people were arrested and nearly 400,000 people were executed. So that gives us some idea about the number of victims. And of course, millions died in the gulags. And finally, as I said, there were later purges from World War II, the outbreak of it in the Soviet context. The Soviet Union stayed out of the first couple years of World War II until the Germans invaded in June 1941. And of course, 1953 is the year of Stalin's death. Now, historians used to argue that the purges ended with the arrest and murder of Yezhov. Now, why? What's the context? Well, Stalin admitted that the Communist Party had its excesses, and he had admitted this to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So it was a bit excessive during the purges, but this was largely Yezhov's fault. So it wasn't Stalin's fault that there were perhaps too many murders and arrests. It was Yezhov's, and so that's why Stalin had him arrested and whacked as well. However, we now know, and we have a better understanding of the purges, that they simply lessened in their intensity, especially during the Second World War. I mentioned that last lesson, but they did carry on. And they increased in intensity from 1945 onwards. And indeed, in 1949, Stalin had thousands of Leningrad communists arrested, executed, or imprisoned for supposedly planning to set up a rival power base in the city, the so-called Leningrad Affair. And moreover, in 1953, Stalin was planning to wipe out the Jews of the Soviet Union, claiming that many prominent Jewish doctors were trying to poison him and the Politburo. And one reason, by the way, you might say, well, why? Why do this now? And of course, there were a lot of Jewish Soviet citizens who were quite high up in the Bolshevik Party at one time or another. Well, why now? Well, one reason for going after the Jews was that his daughter had an affair with a Jewish man whom Stalin did not like, so there's a personal reason. And another was Stalin's suspicion that the Jews were not reliable Soviets now, because the State of Israel had been founded by this point, and Jews were seen as perhaps having divided loyalties. And rather than being loyal to communism, they were perhaps being loyal to their own ethnic group. Finally, it's worth noting that Stalin's top henchmen, Molotov, Beria, and Voroshilov, all thought that Stalin might have them killed in the 1950s. None of them thought they were safe. And I should put Khrushchev in there as well. So what were the overall results to the purges? Well, big surprise, Stalin was able to destroy any challenge to his power within the party. It's worth stressing this over and over again. He was already in total control of the party by 1929. He really did not have any rivals for power. He had won the power struggle. However, given the man he was, that was not enough. And so he went about destroying, in a real physical way, anyone who even had the slightest potential to taking power from him. Out of the 139 members of the Bolshevik Central Committee of 1935, 110 were arrested by 1939. Out of the nearly 2,000 delegates of the 17th Party Congress, 1,108 were arrested. Some areas such as the Ukraine and Turkmenistan had virtually all of the party's senior members wiped out. Soviet citizens who had endured constant repression since 1917, beginning with Lenin, endured even worse horrors during the purges. Stalin had no potential foes by the end of this. And finally, because the purges resulted in so much human destruction, so many people murdered, so many more people sent to slave labor camps, that industrial production actually slowed down in 1938 and onwards because so many people were being arrested. So, for example, factory managers, some workers, etc. So we do have some statistics that in the Donbass region, which is an industrialized region of what is today Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, coal production plateaued. And that's to say it didn't go down massively, but did go down a little bit during this period. And we must remember that this was during rapid industrialization. So this also slowed down that process to an extent. Conclusions. Kirov's murder launched the purges. Stalin was probably the one who had Kirov murdered to launch the purges as a reason or an excuse. The NKVD was the organ of terror. Yezhov, Yagoda, Beria, these were the men who ran the NKVD at Stalin's behest. Stalin and his main henchmen directed the terror. And ultimately, no one was safe. The Bolsheviks, the military, the common people, and indeed even some of Stalin's closest henchmen. Once again, Yagoda, Yezhov, they were the leaders of the NKVD. They were eliminated. So really no one was safe. From Stalin's point of view, the purges were a great success. He eliminated any potential rival. In contrast, from any moral perspective, it was really one of the greatest crimes in history carried out by a regime that had already committed massive crimes against its own people from the moment Lenin took over in 1917.